My in-laws are threatening to sue me unless I abort the baby they say isn't really my husband's. Victoria showed up at my house on a Thursday morning with a lawyer, a manila folder full of documents, and an expression of pure hatred on her face. I was 17 weeks pregnant and had just finished throwing up for the second time that day when the doorbell rang. I opened the door expecting a package delivery and instead found my mother-in-law standing there with a man in an expensive suit who introduced himself as Gerald Hoffman, family law attorney. Victoria pushed past me into my living room without asking permission and told me to sit down because we needed to have a serious conversation about my pregnancy and my future in this family. I was still in my pajamas with my hair unwashed and morning sickness making my head spin, and I had no idea what was happening. Gerald opened the folder and spread several papers across my coffee table while Victoria stood with her arms crossed, staring at me with disgust. He explained that Victoria and her husband Richard had concerns about the paternity of my unborn child and were prepared to take legal action if I didn't cooperate with their demands. I asked what he was talking about because my husband Ethan and I had been trying to get pregnant for 3 years and this baby was a miracle we'd both been praying for. Victoria laughed this cold, bitter sound and said that was a convenient story, but the timeline didn't add up. She pulled out a document from the folder and slid it across the table toward me. It was a medical report from Ethan's doctor dated 5 months before I got pregnant, stating that Ethan had been diagnosed with severe oligospermia, meaning his sperm count was so low that natural conception was virtually impossible without medical intervention. Victoria said she'd found this report in Ethan's belongings when she was helping him move some boxes from their garage to our new house. She claimed Ethan had never told me about this diagnosis because he was embarrassed and ashamed, but now that I was pregnant, the only logical explanation was that I'd cheated on him with someone else. Gerald added that if the baby wasn't Ethan's biological child, I would be committing fraud and could face serious legal consequences for attempting to pass off another man's child as a member of their family. I tried to explain that Ethan and I had gone through fertility treatments, that we'd seen specialists and done everything possible to conceive, but Victoria cut me off. She said she'd checked with Ethan's insurance and there were no claims for fertility treatments in the past 3 years. No visits to reproductive endocrinologists, no procedures, nothing that would explain how I'd gotten pregnant despite Ethan's medical condition. Gerald pulled out more papers showing Ethan's insurance claims history, and he was right. There were no fertility treatments listed anywhere. Victoria leaned forward and told me she knew exactly what happened. I'd gotten tired of waiting for Ethan to give me a baby, and I'd found someone else to do the job. She said she'd suspected something was wrong when I announced the pregnancy because she knew her son's medical situation, but she'd kept quiet hoping she was mistaken. Now she had proof that this baby couldn't possibly be Ethan's, and she was giving me one chance to do the right thing before she destroyed my life completely. I asked what she meant by doing the right thing, and Victoria's expression hardened even more. She said I needed to terminate the pregnancy immediately and quietly, before Ethan became too attached to a child that wasn't his. If I cooperated, they would pay for the procedure and help me and Ethan get a divorce without dragging my infidelity through the courts. If I refused, they would sue me for fraud, file for an annulment of Ethan's marriage on grounds of deception, and make sure everyone in our community knew I was a cheating liar who tried to trap their son with another man's baby. Gerald added that they had already drafted the legal paperwork and were prepared to file within 24 hours if I didn't agree to their terms. Victoria said I had until 5 o'clock that evening to make my decision and provide proof that I'd scheduled the abortion. She stood up to leave and told me not to bother calling Ethan because they'd already spoken to him about this situation and he was considering his options. She said my husband was devastated and humiliated, and the kindest thing I could do was disappear quietly and let him move on with his life. After they left, I sat on my couch staring at those medical documents and trying to understand what was happening. The report about Ethan's sperm count looked legitimate with official letterhead and a doctor's signature. The insurance records showed no fertility treatments, but I knew with absolute certainty that this baby was Ethan's because I hadn't been with anyone else, not even close. We'd been faithful to each other throughout our entire 5-year marriage. I grabbed my phone and called Ethan at his office, but it went straight to voicemail. I tried 3 more times and sent a dozen text messages asking him to call me immediately, that his mother had just been here making insane accusations. I waited 20 minutes with no response and then drove to his workplace, a financial planning firm downtown where he worked as a senior advisor. The receptionist looked uncomfortable when I asked for Ethan and said he'd called in sick that morning. I knew he hadn't been sick when he left for work at 7:30. Something was very wrong. I drove to Ethan's parents' house, a massive colonial in the wealthiest neighborhood in our city. Richard answered the door and told me Ethan wasn't there and I needed to leave their property. I pushed past him and called for my husband, my voice echoing through their marble foyer. Victoria appeared at the top of their curved staircase and told me I was trespassing, and they'd call the police if I didn't leave immediately. I screamed that I needed to talk to Ethan, that whatever lies they'd told him weren't true. Richard grabbed my arm and started pulling me toward the door, and that's when Ethan appeared from the kitchen. He looked terrible, like he hadn't slept in days, with red eyes and rumpled clothes. I tried to go to him, but Richard held me back. I asked Ethan to tell me what was going on, why he was hiding from me, why he was letting his parents accuse me of cheating when he knew I would never do that. Ethan just stared at me with this broken expression and said he needed time to think. Victoria put her hand on his shoulder and told him he didn't owe me anything, that I'd made my choices and now I had to face the consequences. I asked Ethan directly if he believed I'd cheated on him, and he said he didn't know what to believe anymore. His voice was hollow and defeated, nothing like the man I'd married. He said he'd never told me about the diagnosis because the doctor had assured him it didn't mean conception was impossible, just unlikely, and he'd been afraid I would leave him if I knew he might not be able to give me children. He'd kept hoping we'd get pregnant naturally, and he'd never have to tell me about his fertility issues. When I announced I was pregnant 3 months ago, he'd been thrilled but also confused about how it happened. His parents had found the medical report 2 weeks ago and confronted him with it, and now he was questioning everything about our marriage and whether I'd been faithful. I tried to explain that medical diagnoses weren't absolute certainties, that doctors were wrong sometimes, that miracles happened. But Victoria cut in and said it wasn't a miracle, it was infidelity, and I needed to stop lying to her son's face. She told Ethan he deserved better than a wife who would betray him and try to pass off another man's child as his own. Richard finally pushed me out the front door and told me I had until 5 o'clock to comply with their demands or they'd file suit. The door slammed and I stood on their porch sobbing and trying to understand how my life had fallen apart in less than 4 hours. I drove home and immediately called my obstetrician's office, asking for an emergency appointment. The nurse said the doctor could see me the next morning and I begged for something sooner, but that was the best they could do. I spent the rest of that day researching oligospermia and natural conception rates. I found dozens of medical articles explaining that low sperm count didn't mean zero sperm count, that men with this diagnosis fathered biological children all the time, that it just took longer and sometimes required medical assistance but wasn't impossible. I printed out every article I could find and organized them into a folder to show Ethan. But when I tried calling him again, my calls went straight to voicemail and my text showed as delivered but unread. He'd blocked me or turned off his phone entirely. That evening at exactly 5 o'clock, Gerald Hoffman called my cell phone and asked if I'd made my decision. I told him I wasn't aborting my baby because it was Ethan's child and this entire accusation was based on a misunderstanding of medical probabilities. Gerald sighed and said he'd expected this response but was disappointed I was choosing the difficult path. He said the lawsuit would be filed first thing in the morning and I should expect to be served with papers within the week. He added that Victoria and Richard were prepared to make this very ugly and very public, and I should consider hiring my own attorney immediately. I asked how they could legally force me to have an abortion, and Gerald explained they weren't forcing anything, but they could sue for fraud, emotional distress, and damages related to my deception. They could seek an annulment of my marriage and demand repayment of any financial support they'd provided during my relationship with Ethan. If the baby was born and later proven not to be Ethan's biological child, they could pursue additional charges related to paternity fraud and seek full custody to remove the child from my care as an unfit mother. The legal fees alone would bankrupt me, and the public scandal would destroy any credibility I had in our community. I hung up and called the only person I could think of who might help, my older sister Rachel. She lived 2 states away but answered on the second ring. I told her everything that had happened and she was silent for a long moment before saying this sounded like something bigger than just concerns about paternity. She said Victoria and Richard had always been controlling toward Ethan, but this level of aggression suggested another motive. Rachel asked if there was any reason they might want to break up my marriage beyond just protecting Ethan from potential infidelity. I couldn't think of anything at first, but then I remembered the inheritance. Ethan's grandmother had died 8 months earlier and left her entire estate to be divided among her grandchildren, with the stipulation that they had to be married with children to receive their full share. Ethan stood to inherit nearly $2 million once we had a baby. If Victoria could prove I'd cheated and have our marriage annulled, Ethan would be single again, and the inheritance would revert to the family trust that Victoria and Richard controlled until he remarried and had legitimate children. Rachel said that had to be it, that Victoria was manufacturing this crisis to maintain control over money that rightfully belonged to Ethan. She told me to document everything, save all communications, and find a lawyer who specialized in family law and estate disputes. I asked her if she really thought Victoria would go this far just for money, and Rachel reminded me that Victoria had sued her own sister 5 years ago over a property dispute and hadn't spoken to her in the aftermath. Victoria valued control and money above all else, including her son's happiness. I thanked Rachel and spent the rest of the night researching attorneys and trying to figure out how I could afford legal representation. Ethan and I had a joint bank account with about $30,000 in savings, money we'd been setting aside for the baby. If Victoria froze our accounts or if Ethan turned against me completely, I'd have nothing to pay a lawyer and fight this case. I barely slept that night, alternating between crying and researching and checking my phone hoping Ethan would call. The next morning, I went to my obstetrician appointment and explained the situation to Dr. Patel, my doctor for the past 3 years. She was shocked and said the accusations made no medical sense. She pulled up my chart and showed me the detailed records of my fertility journey with Ethan. We'd done 3 rounds of intrauterine insemination using Ethan's sperm 18 months before I conceived naturally. The IUI attempts hadn't worked, but they'd proven Ethan's sperm was viable enough for conception to be possible. Dr. Patel said she'd been the one to recommend we take a break from fertility treatments and try naturally for 6 months before considering IVF, and that's exactly what we'd done. She showed me the notes from Ethan's semen analysis performed in her office, which had shown oligospermia but not azoospermia. The difference was crucial because oligospermia meant low sperm count but not zero, which meant natural conception was unlikely, but absolutely possible. Dr. Patel asked why Ethan's family was claiming there were no fertility treatments in the insurance records. I showed her the documents Gerald had presented, and Dr. Patel immediately identified the problem. We'd paid for the fertility treatments out of pocket because our insurance didn't cover them, a fact we'd discussed extensively at the time. Ethan's company insurance had specifically excluded fertility and reproductive services, so we'd used our savings to pay the clinic directly. There wouldn't be any insurance claims because we'd never filed any. Dr. Patel printed out every record she had showing our fertility journey, including the signed consent forms from Ethan for the IUI procedures, his semen analysis results, and the treatment summaries. She wrote a detailed letter explaining that natural conception was medically possible given Ethan's diagnosis and our treatment history. She said she'd testify in court if necessary that this baby was absolutely Ethan's biological child based on the medical evidence. I hugged her and cried with relief because finally I had proof, real medical documentation that would prove Victoria's accusations were false. I left the appointment feeling hopeful for the first time since this nightmare began. I drove straight to Ethan's office with the medical records, determined to show him the truth before his mother could poison him further against me. The receptionist tried to stop me, but I pushed past her and found Ethan in his office staring at his computer screen. He looked up when I entered and I saw pain and confusion in his eyes, but also something harder, like he was trying to build walls between us. I put Dr. Patel's documentation on his desk and begged him to read it, to see the proof that we'd done fertility treatments together and that his diagnosis didn't make conception impossible. Ethan picked up the papers and read through them slowly. I watched his expression change from skepticism to confusion to something that might have been hope. He asked why he didn't remember signing consent forms for IUI procedures, and I reminded him about the 3 appointments we'd gone to together at the fertility clinic, how nervous he'd been, how we'd held hands in the waiting room. Ethan's face crumpled, and he admitted his memory of that time was fuzzy because he'd been heavily medicated for anxiety and depression after receiving his diagnosis. I sat down across from him and took his hands, trying to reconnect with my husband, who felt like a stranger. I told him everything about how hard we'd tried to get pregnant, how we'd spent thousands of dollars we didn't really have on treatments his insurance wouldn't cover, how we'd agreed to take a break and just live our lives and let nature take its course. I reminded him of the night 6 months ago when we'd stayed up late talking about baby names and nursery colors, how excited he'd been when I showed him the positive pregnancy test, how he'd cried and kissed my stomach and told our baby how much we already loved them. Ethan started crying too and said he wanted to believe me, but his parents had been in his ear constantly for 2 weeks, showing him evidence and making arguments he couldn't refute. They'd convinced him I was a liar and a cheat who'd gotten pregnant to trap him and access his inheritance. I showed him the inheritance connection Rachel had identified and asked if he knew his parents would lose control of that money once our baby was born. Ethan's expression shifted to shock, and he said his parents had told him they were trying to protect him from being hurt, not that they had any financial interest in breaking up our marriage. We talked for 3 hours in his office, going through every piece of evidence and every accusation his parents had made. Slowly, I watched Ethan come back to himself, watched him remember who we were together and what we'd built over 5 years of marriage. He called Dr. Patel's office right there and spoke with her directly, asking her to confirm everything in her letter. Dr. Patel spent 20 minutes on the phone explaining the medical details and assuring Ethan that his biological fatherhood was not only possible, but highly probable given the timeline and treatment history. When he hung up, Ethan looked at me with devastation and guilt written across his face. He said he was so sorry for doubting me, for letting his parents manipulate him, for abandoning me when I needed him most. He admitted he'd been staying at his parents' house because they'd convinced him I would try to manipulate him into staying in the marriage through tears and guilt. He said they'd made him turn off his phone and avoid all contact with me so I couldn't influence him before he made his decision about the lawsuit. I told him his mother had given me until 5 o'clock yesterday to abort our baby, and he went pale. He said his parents had told him they just wanted me to take a paternity test after the baby was born, not that they were demanding I terminate the pregnancy. Ethan grabbed his car keys and said we were going to his parents' house immediately to confront them with the medical evidence and end this insanity. I followed him in my own car, afraid he might change his mind if I wasn't there to back him up. We arrived at the house and Victoria's face went white when she saw us together. She tried to close the door, but Ethan pushed it open and walked into the foyer with me right behind him. Richard appeared from his office and started telling Ethan I'd clearly gotten to him, that I was manipulating him exactly as they'd warned. Ethan held up Dr. Patel's documentation and asked his parents to explain how they'd missed the entire fertility treatment history when they were investigating my pregnancy. Victoria glanced at the papers and said those could be easily faked, that I probably paid some clinic to create false records. Ethan said he'd personally spoken with Dr. Patel and verified everything, that he remembered the treatments now that his head was clear. He asked his parents point blank if they'd been lying to him about their motives, if this was really about protecting him or about controlling his grandmother's inheritance. Victoria's expression went cold and calculating. She said the inheritance was beside the point, that she was trying to save her son from a woman who would cheat on him and lie about paternity. She insisted I must have been with someone else because the medical evidence against natural conception was too strong. Richard added that even if we'd done some fertility treatments years ago, that didn't prove this particular pregnancy resulted from Ethan's sperm. For all they knew, I'd gotten tired of the process failing and found an easier solution with someone more fertile. Ethan shouted at his father to stop, to listen to reason, to admit they were wrong. But Victoria doubled down and said if Ethan chose to stay with me, he was making the biggest mistake of his life. She told him they would proceed with the lawsuit whether he supported it or not, that they had legal standing as concerned family members to challenge paternity and protect their family's interests. She said if this baby was born and proved not to be Ethan's biological child, they would make sure I never saw the child again because I was clearly unfit to be a mother based on my deceptive behavior and attempts to commit fraud. Ethan told his mother that if she filed that lawsuit, he would cut off all contact with them permanently. Victoria laughed and said he'd said that before during his rebellious teenage years, but he always came back because he needed them. Ethan said he didn't need them anymore, that he had a wife who loved him and a baby on the way, and that was all the family he required. He took my hand and we walked toward the door, but Victoria called after us. She said she'd already filed the lawsuit this morning, that the papers would be served to me within 48 hours, and that she hoped we were prepared for the legal battle ahead. She said they had unlimited resources and the best attorneys money could buy, while we had nothing but medical records that proved nothing definitive. Richard added that they'd also filed a restraining order request claiming I'd harassed them and trespassed on their property, and if I came near them again, I'd be arrested. I felt sick, but Ethan squeezed my hand and kept walking. We got in his car and he drove us home to start figuring out our next steps. That night, Ethan transferred $50,000 from his personal account to a new joint account only he and I could access. He said it was money his grandmother had given him years ago as a graduation gift, separate from the inheritance trust. He called 3 different attorneys and made consultations for the next week. He packed a bag with all his belongings from his parents' house and told me he was never going back. We lay in bed together and Ethan put his hand on my stomach, feeling for the baby's movements. He apologized over and over for doubting me, for letting his parents manipulate him, for not being strong enough to see through their lies immediately. I told him I understood that they were his parents and he'd trusted them, that family manipulation was the hardest to recognize because it came wrapped in love and concern. He said he knew now that their love had always been conditional on his obedience, and he was done being their puppet. We made a plan to fight this lawsuit with everything we had, and to prove once and for all that this baby was his biological child. The lawsuit papers arrived 3 days later via process server who showed up at our house at 6 a.m. The complaint was 40 pages long and included charges of fraud, emotional distress, conspiracy to commit paternity fraud, and seeking injunctive relief to prevent me from listing Ethan as the father on the birth certificate until paternity could be legally established. They were asking for emergency DNA testing to be done immediately, even though I was only 18 weeks pregnant and the procedures for prenatal paternity testing carried risks to the baby. Our attorney, a sharp woman named Diana Foster who specialized in family law and estate disputes, read through the complaint and said it was one of the most aggressive and vindictive suits she'd seen in 20 years of practice. She said Victoria and Richard were clearly trying to intimidate us into submission through legal costs and public humiliation. The suit demanded we pay their legal fees if we lost, which could amount to hundreds of thousands of dollars. They'd also filed a separate complaint seeking to have Ethan declared mentally incompetent to make decisions about his marriage and finances, claiming I'd manipulated him through undue influence. Diana explained our options. We could settle by agreeing to paternity testing after the baby was born, which would delay resolution but avoid risky prenatal procedures. We could fight the suit and demand it be dismissed based on lack of evidence and medical documentation proving the accusations were baseless. Or we could countersue for harassment, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and interference with our marriage. Diana recommended we do all 3 simultaneously: refuse prenatal testing on medical grounds, move to dismiss the original suit, and file our own lawsuit establishing that Victoria and Richard's real motive was controlling Ethan's inheritance. She said the inheritance angle was crucial because it showed their accusations weren't based on genuine concern, but on financial manipulation. If we could prove that, their entire case would collapse, and we might even be awarded damages. The downside was that this approach would be expensive, time-consuming, and emotionally exhausting. We'd be fighting for months or possibly years, with our private lives exposed in court documents and media coverage. Diana asked if we were prepared for that level of scrutiny and invasion of privacy. Ethan said we didn't have a choice because giving in to his parents' demands would mean letting them control our lives forever. We authorized Diana to file our response and countersuit. Over the next weeks, the legal battle intensified in ways I couldn't have imagined. Victoria and Richard's attorneys filed motions demanding access to my medical records, my phone records, my social media accounts, even my work emails. They subpoenaed my friends and coworkers, asking invasive questions about my relationships and fidelity. They hired a private investigator who followed me everywhere, photographing me at the grocery store, at my prenatal appointments, at my sister's house when I drove there for emotional support. The investigator's reports were filed with the court, trying to establish some pattern of suspicious behavior, even though all I did was normal pregnancy activities. Victoria gave an interview to a local news outlet claiming she was a concerned mother trying to protect her son from a manipulative woman, and suddenly our case was public knowledge. My phone exploded with messages from people I barely knew, some supporting me, most condemning me as a cheater trying to trap a wealthy man. My employer called me into a meeting and said the media attention was becoming disruptive to the workplace. They suggested I take a leave of absence until the legal matter was resolved. I asked if I was being fired and they said no, just strongly encouraged to step away temporarily. I knew it was discrimination, but I didn't have the energy to fight another battle, so I agreed to take unpaid leave. Without my income and with mounting legal bills, our finances were being stretched thin despite Ethan's salary and the money he'd transferred. Diana's fees were $10,000 a month, not including court costs and expert witness fees. We had to hire our own medical experts to testify about fertility and conception probabilities. We had to pay for depositions and document review. The $50,000 Ethan had transferred was disappearing fast. He tried to access his inheritance early through the estate attorneys, but Victoria and Richard had filed an injunction blocking any distributions until the paternity question was resolved. They were systematically cutting off our financial resources while drowning us in legal costs. The preliminary hearing happened when I was 24 weeks pregnant, visibly showing and exhausted from the stress. Victoria and Richard sat on one side of the courtroom with their team of 3 attorneys, all in expensive suits and carrying leather briefcases. Ethan and I sat with Diana, trying to look confident while I felt my baby kicking inside me, responding to my elevated heart rate. The judge was an older woman named Kathleen Murray, who'd been on the bench for 30 years. She listened to both sides present their arguments about whether emergency prenatal paternity testing should be ordered. Victoria's lead attorney argued that every day we delayed was another day of emotional trauma for his clients, who were suffering from uncertainty about their potential grandchild's legitimacy. He said Ethan was being manipulated by a woman who refused to prove her claims because she knew the baby wasn't his. Diana countered that prenatal paternity testing carried a small but real risk of miscarriage, and forcing an invasive medical procedure on a pregnant woman based on speculation was both dangerous and unconstitutional. She presented Dr. Patel's medical records and testimony, showing that natural conception was medically feasible, and that we had documented fertility treatment history. Judge Murray asked Victoria's attorneys what evidence they had besides a diagnosis of oligospermia and the absence of insurance claims. The lead attorney presented what he called circumstantial evidence, including the fact that I'd been seen having lunch with a male coworker 3 times in the months before I got pregnant. He showed the court photographs from the private investigator of me sitting across a restaurant table from a man, clearly in conversation. He suggested this proved I'd had an inappropriate relationship outside my marriage. I wanted to scream because the man in those photos was David Chen from my marketing department, and we'd been working on a joint project that required frequent meetings. But the way Victoria's attorney presented it made those innocent work lunches look sinister and secretive. Diana objected strongly and said having lunch with coworkers wasn't evidence of infidelity, and the photographs showed nothing inappropriate. Judge Murray seemed skeptical of Victoria's attorney's arguments, but said she needed time to review all the medical evidence before making a ruling. She scheduled another hearing for 6 weeks later and denied the emergency testing request, saying the risk to the pregnancy outweighed the need for immediate answers. Walking out of that courthouse, I felt both relieved and terrified. We'd won this round, but the war was far from over. Ethan held my hand tight and told me we were going to get through this together. That night, I found him crying in our baby's nursery, surrounded by the furniture we'd picked out and the stuffed animals we'd been collecting. He said he couldn't believe his own parents were doing this to us, that they valued money more than their grandchild or their son's happiness. I held him, and we both cried, mourning the family relationships that were being destroyed by greed and control. Over the next weeks, the harassment escalated. Someone spray-painted cheater on our garage door. We got threatening letters in the mail saying we should be ashamed of ourselves. Victoria started a social media campaign suggesting I was a gold digger who'd trapped her son with a fake pregnancy. She posted old photos of Ethan with other women from before we met, implying he should have married someone else. Her friends and family shared the posts, creating an echo chamber of hatred directed at me. I developed complications from the stress. My blood pressure spiked dangerously high, and Dr. Patel put me on bed rest at 30 weeks. She said if my blood pressure didn't stabilize, she'd have to deliver the baby early, which carried its own risks. Ethan took time off work to care for me, bringing me meals and medication and trying to keep me calm. But every day brought new legal motions, new accusations, new attacks on my character. Diana filed our countersuit alleging that Victoria and Richard's actions were designed to interfere with Ethan's inheritance by preventing the birth or delegitimizing the baby. She subpoenaed the estate documents and found the exact clause that Victoria was exploiting. Ethan would receive his full inheritance only when he had a legitimate biological child born within his legal marriage. If the baby was declared illegitimate, or if our marriage was annulled, the money reverted to family control. Diana argued this proved their entire lawsuit was financially motivated, not based on genuine concern about paternity. The second hearing was scheduled for when I was 36 weeks pregnant, just 4 weeks from my due date. Diana asked Judge Murray to expedite the case because my health was deteriorating under the stress and the baby would be born soon anyway, making prenatal testing moot. Victoria's attorneys opposed expediting, saying they needed more time to gather evidence. But Judge Murray surprised everyone by saying she'd reviewed all the medical documentation and found Diana's arguments persuasive. She said the medical evidence showed natural conception was possible, that there was documented fertility treatment history, and that the accusations of infidelity were based on speculation rather than proof. She asked Victoria's attorneys directly what concrete evidence they had of me being unfaithful to Ethan, besides suspicious luncheons and convenient timing. The lead attorney fumbled and said the circumstantial evidence was compelling enough to warrant investigation. Judge Murray said circumstantial evidence wasn't sufficient to order invasive medical testing or to make determinations about paternity without the father's support. Since Ethan believed the baby was his and wanted to be recognized as the legal father, she saw no reason to interfere with that parental relationship. Ta-da! Victoria stood up in the courtroom and shouted that the judge was making a mistake, that I'd manipulated everyone including the court. Judge Murray ordered her to sit down and be quiet or be held in contempt. Victoria's face went purple with rage, but she sat. Judge Murray ruled that the request for emergency paternity testing was denied permanently, that I would not be forced to undergo any medical procedures against my will, and that Ethan would be listed as the legal father on the birth certificate, unless proven otherwise after the baby's birth. She said if Victoria and Richard wanted to pursue their paternity claims after the baby was born, they could do so through normal channels, but they would not be granted any special expedited hearings or emergency orders. She also warned them that their behavior had been bordering on harassment, and if it continued, she would consider sanctions, including restraining orders. Victoria's attorneys requested an immediate appeal, and Judge Murray said they were welcome to try, but her ruling stood for now. We walked out of that courthouse feeling like we'd actually won something significant for the first time. But Victoria wasn't done. She filed an appeal within 48 hours and managed to get a temporary hold on Judge Murray's ruling, meaning everything was in limbo again. Her attorneys argued that Judge Murray had shown bias toward us and hadn't properly considered the medical evidence about oligospermia. They found a fertility expert willing to testify that natural conception with Ethan's diagnosis was astronomically unlikely, even though Dr. Patel and 3 other experts Diana had consulted said it was medically possible. The appeal meant we'd be stuck in legal proceedings potentially for months after the baby's birth. Diana filed a motion to dismiss the appeal as frivolous, but the appellate court agreed to hear arguments. We were trapped in this nightmare with no end in sight. I went into labor at 38 weeks, 2 weeks earlier than expected. The stress had taken its toll and my body decided it was time. Ethan drove me to the hospital while calling Diana to inform her the baby was coming. Diana said she'd file an emergency motion to have security present at the hospital because Victoria and Richard might try to interfere with the birth or demand immediate paternity testing. Labor was long and difficult, complicated by my high blood pressure and the emotional trauma of the past months. After 14 hours, our son was born at 6 pounds 8 ounces, perfectly healthy with Ethan's nose and my eyes. Ethan held him and cried, telling our baby boy that he was loved and wanted and that we'd fought so hard to protect him. We named him Lucas, meaning bringer of light, because he'd been the light keeping us going through the darkest time of our lives. The hospital staff was incredible, keeping our room private and posting security to prevent unauthorized visitors. But somehow Victoria found out we'd had the baby and showed up at the hospital with her attorney, demanding access to her grandson and demanding immediate DNA testing. Hospital security turned her away, but not before she'd caused a scene in the maternity ward, upsetting other patients and staff. Diana filed for an emergency restraining order and got it granted within hours, establishing that Victoria and Richard had to stay at least 500 feet away from Lucas until the legal matters were resolved. We spent 3 days in the hospital bonding with Lucas and trying to create a peaceful bubble around our new family. Ethan barely left my side, splitting his time between holding our son and watching him sleep. He kept saying he'd never doubted Lucas was his. Not really, not once he'd seen through his parents' manipulation. But I could see the tiny shadow of doubt they'd planted, the poisonous question that would linger until we had definitive proof. On our last day in the hospital before discharge, I told Ethan we should do a paternity test voluntarily, not because I doubted our son's parentage, but because I wanted to remove every weapon from Victoria's arsenal. If we had scientific proof that Lucas was biologically Ethan's, she'd have nothing left to attack us with. Ethan was hesitant because it felt like giving in to his mother's demands, but Diana thought it was smart strategy. She said if we controlled the testing process and released the results on our terms, we'd undercut Victoria's entire case and possibly end this nightmare once and for all. We arranged for DNA testing through an independent lab that specialized in legal paternity cases. The technician came to our home when Lucas was 1 week old and collected cheek swabs from all 3 of us. The test would take 10 days to process. Those were the longest 10 days of my life, even though I knew rationally what the results would show. I'd never been with anyone besides Ethan. This baby was his biological son. But Victoria's constant accusations had created this tiny seed of irrational doubt, this what-if scenario that kept me awake at night. What if there was some medical impossibility I didn't understand? What if the universe had played some cruel trick? What if I lost Ethan and Lucas because science said something I knew couldn't be true? I drove myself half crazy with worst-case scenarios until the lab called with the results. The technician said she was emailing the full report but wanted to give us the summary immediately. Lucas was definitively, without any doubt, Ethan's biological son. The probability of paternity was 99.99%. There was no possibility of error or question about the results. Ethan collapsed onto our couch with relief so intense he couldn't speak. I held Lucas and cried while calling Diana to give her the news. Diana said this was exactly what we needed, that she'd file these results with the court immediately and move for complete dismissal of Victoria's lawsuit with prejudice, meaning she couldn't refile the same claims ever again. She'd also seek sanctions against Victoria and Richard for bringing a frivolous lawsuit and harassment. Within hours of Diana filing the test results, Victoria's attorneys contacted her asking to negotiate a settlement. They wanted to drop the lawsuit in exchange for us agreeing not to seek damages or sanctions. Diana told them absolutely not, that we wanted everything on record, including a judicial finding that their accusations were false and malicious. Victoria's attorneys tried several more times to settle, but we refused every offer. This case was going to judgment, so there would be no ambiguity about who was right and who was wrong. The final hearing was scheduled for when Lucas was 6 weeks old. We brought him to the courthouse despite Diana's initial reservations, because we wanted Judge Murray to see the baby Victoria had tried to claim wasn't really her grandchild. Judge Murray took one look at Lucas in Ethan's arms and commented that the baby looked remarkably similar to photos of Ethan as an infant. Victoria's attorney presented their final arguments, but they were weak and defensive, trying to frame Victoria's actions as those of a concerned mother, rather than a controlling manipulator. Diana systematically destroyed every argument, presenting the DNA results, the medical records, the inheritance documents proving financial motivation, and evidence of the harassment campaign, including the spray-painted garage, the threatening letters, and the social media attacks. She argued that Victoria and Richard had engaged in a coordinated effort to destroy our family for financial gain and should face consequences for their actions. Judge Murray didn't need long to make her decision. She ruled that Victoria and Richard's lawsuit was completely without merit and based on false allegations made with malicious intent. She found that their primary motivation was controlling Ethan's inheritance rather than any genuine concern about paternity. She ordered the lawsuit dismissed with prejudice and granted our request for sanctions, ordering Victoria and Richard to pay our legal fees, which had totaled nearly $100,000. She also made permanent the restraining order keeping them away from Lucas, unless Ethan specifically granted them permission for supervised contact. Judge Murray looked directly at Victoria and said she'd never seen such a vindictive and harmful campaign by parents against their own child and grandchild, that Victoria's actions had been unconscionable and potentially criminal. She warned that if Victoria attempted any further harassment or interference, she'd face criminal charges for stalking and intimidation. Victoria sat through the judgment stone-faced, but when we left the courthouse, I saw her crying in her car with Richard holding her. Ethan felt no sympathy. He said she'd made her choices and now had to live with the consequences. We went home with Lucas and tried to start rebuilding our lives. The inheritance issue resolved quickly once Victoria's lawsuit was dismissed. The estate attorneys released Ethan's full inheritance from his grandmother, nearly $2 million that gave us financial security and freedom from his parents' control. Ethan used part of the money to pay off our legal fees before Victoria's ordered payment came through, saying he didn't want to be connected to his parents through debt. We bought a new house in a different neighborhood where nobody knew our story. Ethan cut off all contact with his parents and told them through Diana that if they wanted any relationship with Lucas in the future, they'd need to demonstrate years of changed behavior and genuine remorse. He said he might forgive them eventually, but he'd never forget what they'd tried to do to our family. Victoria and Richard made several attempts to reach out through relatives and friends, always claiming they'd been trying to protect Ethan and had made mistakes but ultimately acted out of love. Ethan never responded. Life settled into a new normal. I went back to work when Lucas was 3 months old, to a different company that didn't know about the lawsuit. Ethan changed jobs too, wanting a fresh start without his old colleagues' knowledge of the family drama. We started therapy together to process the trauma and learn healthier communication patterns. Lucas grew into a happy, healthy toddler who looked more like Ethan every day, eliminating any possible doubt about paternity just by existing. By the time Lucas was 2, Ethan's grandfather reached out saying he'd followed the court case and was ashamed of what Victoria and Richard had done. He wanted to have a relationship with his great-grandson if we'd allow it. We met with him cautiously, but he proved genuine in his remorse and became a loving presence in Lucas's life, without any of his daughter Victoria's controlling tendencies. Through him, we learned that Victoria and Richard's marriage had been strained by the lawsuit fallout, that Victoria had become isolated after her friends learned the truth, that she regretted her actions but was too proud to admit it directly to Ethan. When Lucas was 4, Ethan received a letter from his mother. She'd been diagnosed with cancer and was undergoing treatment. She said she didn't expect forgiveness but wanted him to know she'd realized too late how much damage she'd caused chasing money and control. She said watching us build a beautiful family without her had taught her that love couldn't be commanded or manipulated, only freely given. She asked only that Lucas might someday know she existed and that she'd loved him in her own broken way. Ethan cried reading the letter but didn't respond. He said some wounds were too deep and some trust too shattered to rebuild. Victoria died 18 months later. Ethan didn't attend the funeral. Years later, when Lucas was 8, we finally told him an age-appropriate version of what had happened before he was born. We explained that his grandmother had been very sick in her mind and had tried to hurt our family because she was afraid and controlling. Lucas asked if he could see pictures of her and we showed him a few. He studied her face and said she looked sad. Ethan agreed she'd probably been sad her whole life because she'd valued all the wrong things and pushed away everyone who mattered. Now, Lucas is 12 and thriving, unaware of how close he came to being the center of a family destroyed by greed. Ethan and I are stronger for having survived the crucible together, our marriage forged in fire and proven unbreakable. My in-laws tried to force me to abort the baby they claimed wasn't my husband's, but instead they lost everything that mattered while we built a life defined by love rather than control. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.